Okay, all right. So I'm going to start. We are running a bit late, but we'll find a way to catch up. So my name is Tetsu Yung. Thank you for coming to LangFest as a LangFest organizer, and thank you for coming to my talk. So my main thing is not about me learning languages, but really about me raising my kids in multilingual to become multilingual. So the title is the scientific and not so scientific, mostly not so scientific, reasons for starting as early as possible in raising multilingual children. And this is a little tradition of mine. Every time I give a talk, I get my son to do the welcome.
Welcome to LangFest! 欢迎大家到 LangFest! Bienvenue au LangFest! Bienvenidos a LangFest! LangFest ようこそ!
Yeah. Ronnie just turned 7 about a month ago. Who can read this? First one. Emmanuel. Emmanuel, what's he? 残念。三つ子の魂100枚。Okay. The soul of a 3-year-old remains till 100. Second one is in Mandarin. Who can read this? Please. 3岁定80. So the accent's a little off, but 3岁定, it's close. It's 3 years old, fixes 80. I mean, it's sort of meaning your character at 3 years old is pretty much stable or fixed until 80. So it's a little shorter life expectancy, I guess. I don't know why. but essentially means, kids as young as 3 years old, it's pretty much their character is already formed. Whether you agree with that or not is up to debate, but these are pretty famous, I guess, proverbs in Japanese and in Mandarin. So my topic is really to emphasize the importance of starting early in language acquisition. It's 2 parts. The first part is all the theory, okay, the why and the literature out there, and then the second part will be the examples that we have in our family. So the real life applications of some of the stuff that we'll be talking about in the first part. So briefly, I'll go through the bullet points you've got. First, it's really about the brain development period. It's a very fast and short period at the beginning of life. Also, another important aspect is to learn the ability to learn multiple languages at a native or near native level. Also, you want to beat the clock to the establishment of self-consciousness, self-esteem, pride, the kind of psychological traits. And there's also physiological and actual brain benefits that's been talked about in the literature. And finally, more of an economic or financial sort of angle on that is opportunity costs. Okay. So here's a little video, really to summarize what we base our thoughts on. It's a minute and a half. Take a look.
By the time a human embryo is 5 weeks old, it is just the size of an apple seed, but the brain has already begun to grow. By 8 weeks, the basic structure of the brain and central nervous system are in place. The neural networks are spreading out, and even now the nerve signals are traveling more than 150 miles an hour. At birth, nearly all 100 billion neurons of the human brain are already in place, but the brain only weighs about 25% of what it will later on. It's about to embark on its fastest growing period, quadrupling in size by the time a child finishes preschool. By age 6, the brain is 90%, of its adult size. During that burst of growth, 700 new neural connections are formed every second as we gain the capacity to smile around 2 months, to talk usually around a year, and to dress ourselves around the age of 3. In those early years, in fact throughout our lives, the brain changes through experience, learning to speak, taking those first steps, understanding colors and shapes, forming novel thoughts. But as certain neurons are used more frequently, other unused neurons go away. It's a process called pruning. And almost anything can shape us in those baby and toddler years. First words, first ice cream, first TV show, first argument, for better or worse.
So I was really glad to see this video. It really summarizes a lot of information into 90 seconds or so. So I'll summarize here again. Basically, we're saying at birth, the baby's brain is only about 25% of the size of the adult brain. But it goes into the fastest growth, developmental phase in its lifetime, up to about 6 years old. And at 6 years old, the development is almost all done. It's like about 90% or so. And here's the really amazing part. I mean, I was blown away by these data. And apparently, there's 700, and some articles say 1,000. So 700 to 1,000 synapses. That's connections between neurons that are being formed every second. Every second in the child's life during the first years, this brain is developing and creating these synapses, peaking at around 3 years old, and then going all the way up to about 6, 7 years old. And the little curiosity, I got a little curious, and I calculated that, and it's about 132 billion synapses. But in the video, it also talks about pruning, which is a process of deleting and loss of the unused neurons. So basically, you're forming a lot of neurons based on a lot of information, stimulation, the stimuli that the kids are receiving every day. Everything they do, they're curious, they're wandering around, they're learning every single minute and every single second. But around from 3 to 6, they start this process called pruning, where now the neurons that are not really used a lot, even though they formed them, they get lost. Now this will be important in later slides. So again, during this really early part of the baby's life, it's a period of high curiosity, period of high cultural sensitivity, empathy, tolerance. They're just absorbing everything, they're just learning. And I would sort of compare this as an analogy to building a house. So if your brain development is sort of like building a house, and what we're talking about today in specifically to language learning, if we compare languages to maybe wiring or plumbing of a house, when's the best time to install it? Of course, it's at the time of building your house. And I may get complaints about this, but it is possible to add later. Many of us actually do it later. But it's sort of like tearing down some walls and putting in pipes again. It's not quite the same. It's a lot more labor intensive. We all know how hard it is to learn languages as an adult. So that's sort of how I see it. If you lay down everything at the get-go, if you know already, for example, you want your kids to be bilingual or trilingual or whatever you want them to, then as early as possible is my recommendation. It's really how I see it. You can do it later, but I think it'll be more costly and probably not as effective. And the point about learning multiple languages like a native speaker is a good data that says, or information that says the children who learn a second language or a third language, before the age of 5, they actually use a similar part of the brain as their mother tongue. So actually the same mechanism, I guess, their mother tongue is applied to their second or third or fourth language. So that may explain why they are able to go on and achieve very high levels of proficiency, native-like, good accents, etc. And about, I would say, 10, 15 years ago, I guess, I saw a really nice video on the TED Talks by Dr. Patricia Kuhl from Washington State University. And she talked about this critical period hypothesis. I mean, I don't think she came up with the hypothesis, but she was the first one, it's the first video that I saw that talked about the critical period hypothesis. So again, remember, the brain development up to about 6 years old, you've completed about 90% of your development. And coincidentally, they say that the ability for a child to learn a language to a very high level, native-like, or at native level, is up to about 3 to 7 years old. Now that's an observation. Mechanistically, maybe up to debate, but that is the observation that we see in the general public, thematic decline. Kids who start learning it from 8 to 10, or 11 to 15, 17 to 39, where you've pretty much fallen off the map if you want to learn it passively or naturally, I guess. Perhaps you guys who are passionate about languages, it's a separate story that we can debate, but at least if you see in the general public, general population, this is the kind of curve that we see. And there's no debate about this observation per se. And she went on to give an example about how little children are like little scientists, and they take data on everything they hear. So if you have a mother who's an English-speaking mother, and her pronunciations of, for example, R's and L's, which are very clear in the English language, the kids will be able to hear them very distinctly and be able to recognize them. Whereas if you come from a Japanese family, the Japanese alphabet per se does not really distinguish between the L and R. It's more closer to like an almost L sound. It's a la, ri, ru, re, ro, which is not an R, not an L, but it's really somewhere in the middle. Now, I've always thought the Japanese were not very good at pronouncing these words, but it turns out that it's because they can't really hear it well. They can't distinguish the different sounds. I always thought it was like their vocal muscles that they've not trained it enough. They can hear it, but they can't pronounce it. But no, they can't even hear it. I've tested this out on some colleagues in Japan, and you tell them, turn on the right, or the light. They don't hear the difference between the light and the right, and the vase and the bass, and so it's really a hearing thing. Is this related to pruning? Possibly. I'm not seeing direct evidence, but it's coincidence that it's in a similar period. And my mother talks to me about this a lot. So it's known that different languages cover different areas on the human auditory spectrum, which ranges from the lower 100 hertz all the way up to about 20,000 hertz. That's the range that the human ear can hear and distinguish. Now, you've got different languages, Japanese or English, French, German, that sort of covers different areas. And if you speak that language only, the other wavelengths or frequencies become harder for you to distinguish. This is sort of consistent with what Patricia Kuhl was talking about, the ability to distinguish sounds in different types of sounds that are produced in your language versus other languages. So with this, at least, the theory is if you know more languages, you could cover more area on the spectrum and potentially be able to hear better later in life. Sort of like keep your ear, if you do this up to 10 or 12, 15 years old, you could keep this for life. That's sort of what my mother tells me. So another topic we mentioned earlier is this time period where you can beat the clock to the establishment of self-consciousness, pride, self-esteem. So kids kids are kids. They play and they learn, and they're not afraid of making mistakes. They're not afraid of losing face or embarrassments. So I mean, here is a proverb or a famous quote from Thomas Sachs that says, "Every act of conscious learning requires a willingness to suffer an injury to one's self-esteem." So again, so children are able to learn just because, before they're aware of their own self-importance, then they're really able to learn very quickly, and that's a psychological aspect of really learning early in life. I mean, how many of us have this mental block speaking our second language or third language to other people just because the kids don't seem to have that. They can say, they can go on with error after error, but they don't care, and they're like little bulldozers and just go on. And they're just masters at making friends. I see this with my kids, and I know many of your kids are like that. They just go to a park, and suddenly they're playing with other kids. They're sharing their toys. They're fighting, and then they're playing again. They're just masters at building these relationships very quickly. So the next topic was about the physiological, the benefits of learning multiple languages at a young age. Research apparently has shown that learning languages boosts problem solving, critical thinking, listening skills, memory concentration. Memory, my wife might not agree, but ability to multitask is also not my strength. But creativity, mental flexibility, there's a lot of advantages to learning languages, even as adults, but the earlier you do it, it should be better, as the gray matter density apparently is much higher if you learn earlier. So also we see a lot of literature, articles about resistance to mental decline. That's like Alzheimer's disease. The onset of Alzheimer's disease is delayed. And again, learning in general, complex thinking, creativity. So there's only good stuff in learning multiple languages. And finally, this will be the last theory part, opportunity cost. But it's simple. I only have one slide on this. It's basically what are you giving up in exchange for learning languages? So if you're a kid, you have a lot of time. You have a lot of time. So why not, build language learning into their daily lives and get them to learn as early as possible, because later in life, you've got studies, you've got work, you've got family, you've got this and that, and LangFest, and this and that, okay? So do it earlier, and it'll save you a lot of time later. I would like to credit, my studies mainly in I did my PhD in molecular biology. It has nothing to do with languages. I think because I didn't really have to spend a lot of time during my university studies to actually do languages per se. So it's just a way of looking at investing in the future. If you already want that for your kids, if you already want a second or third or fourth language for your kids, then the earlier the better. The higher the return on investment, I guess is we would say it. So I've done a lot of talking. So what do we do in our family that applies what I just discussed? Well, for one thing, we do OPAL. OPAL from day one and even before. This is my first son was still inside, and we talked to I talked to my wife's tummy, but from that time I was already speaking only in Mandarin with my son and all my children. That's all I speak exclusively Mandarin with them. And this is a method called one person, one language, and we really follow it like a religion. I never deviate from that. And so that's from day one and even before. That's been planned, and it's continuing to this day, and it will continue on for the next for the years that we're going to carrying on this strategy. And we can do that to a pretty extreme degree, partly because we have a quite special case, I guess, in terms of family structure. We live in Quebec. My father is Taiwanese, my mother is Japanese, and I'm right there, so I am half Taiwanese, half Japanese. My wife is 100% Japanese. Her parents live in Japan, and they're both Japanese. So my kids, Ronnie, Nika, and Akila, are quarter Taiwanese and 3/4 Japanese. And so right here, myself, actually, okay. So right here, myself, my father, we speak Mandarin with the kids. My wife and my mother in the middle here, they speak Japanese with the kids. And living in Quebec, and we would have English and French pretty naturally. They go to French school, French daycare. And the first language that we really introduced artificially was Spanish. And we invite au pairs from Mexico to create this environment where they have to speak Spanish all the time to this one person. And sometimes we also have au pairs who would take care of the English. That's like an on and off thing. So this is why our kids naturally would have to use 5 languages in their daily lives. And this is how we constructed the environment. And also, since we have family and friends in Japan and Taiwan, and these languages, Japanese and Mandarin, are very important for us, we live a lifestyle of 4 months in Japan and Taiwan. In fact, we just came back from Taiwan a week ago. And we spend 8 months, so August to about April, we spend here in Canada. They go to school as usual. And we do this cycle. We've been doing this for about 3 years now, 3-4 years now. Since we came back, actually, we were originally in Japan and Taiwan, but we all came back since I wanted to do this type of lifestyle. So our kids, through this lifestyle, they have family in different countries. So in Canada, in Japan, in Taiwan. They have friends. So again, this critical period at the very beginning of their lives where they're very culturally sensitive, empathy, open-mindedness. This is the time where we build it into their lives and allow them to be open-minded and learn about all these different cultures and ways of life. So, the friends, they can make friends in any of these countries' environments. And I'll skip these for the time, but when they watch TV, if they watch in Canada, it'll be in English. If they watch in Taiwan, the same cartoon will be in Mandarin, and they just do it without any hesitation. They just go on and carry on as if. And we send them to schools, the local schools. So the middle here is let's say the base case. Their school in Canada, very the normal North American North American style. And then in the spring we go to Japan. We send them to a local Japanese school, and you would get them to integrate into the Japanese school system and let them experience life as a Japanese student. Like you see that picture at the top left. That's a typical first grade look in Japan. They call it a pika pika no ichinensei. So the shiny little first grader. All the first graders love it. They get their backpack and and you see here's a little classroom. My son's at the very back. You see uniformity. They go in and they just live it. They don't learn about it in the book. They live it. Okay? Down here is the sports day. Big thing in Japan. All the schools do this. All the schools do this. They go and they get to the sports life. You learn as a Japanese student. Here it's in Taiwan, less uniform, but still, goes into goes off on a picnic with the friends, and this is their sports day uniform. So they go to Taiwan, to Japan, go into the system and just blends in and lives the whole cultural experience while using their languages, while perfecting their languages. And of course, you can't talk about culture without talking about food. I mean, that's it. You know, how many times we have come to Canada and say, hey, this is really good. You want to try some octopus? And people are like, why? You know, or seaweed. Oh, it stinks. You know, it's our culture from where we come from. And you can be disgusted at something, but I hope my kids will not have this type of reaction. They can dislike something, but be respectful. Knowing that there's many different types of things around the world, they can learn about it. And sports, of course. The culture of hockey, right? Culture of sporting and skating. That's a Canadian thing. They live it. For the 8 months that they're here, a lot of it is this and that. And my daughter loves horseback riding or gymnastics. And then we go to Taiwan or Japan. We send them to local swimming classes. And again, they have to go into the system. They have to learn how to behave and work with other kids. Also learn with coaches, right? That's my youngest this year. We send him to a swimming course in Japan, in Nagasaki. He's got to learn how to talk with coaches. It's a different thing. The relationship is vertical in Asia. You don't call your coach John. It's sensei. You learn that through living. Taiwan. My son rollerblades. We go to the driving range. So each country has something to offer, and we just put them through the system. And I talked about learning multiple languages with good accents. Here's just a little example of Ronnie. Hang on. That's with his demands on accents.
是
五六
六
七
七
八
八
九
九
十
十 OK Little teacher OK
这个嘞，这个也是不一样啊。
P127
Oh, very good! 哇！
Percy
Percy， 我以为你会说 Percy。Percy， Percy，
不是巴奇，是 Percy，
Very good, Percy。
不是巴奇，
不是Percy。
Launcher
那怎么讲
Launcher
龙
Launcher
讲
Shark
讲
Shark
讲
Shark
讲，不是。
On
deux,
deux
trois,
trois
quatre,
quatre
quatre,
quatre Está bien quatre
six,
quatre
cinq,
cinq
six,
six
sept.
sept Oh, gracias, Ronnie.
So they hear all the intricacies and the pronunciations in each language. So naturally, they're very demanding on others with these languages, right? And I also want to touch upon one of our strategies that I mentioned earlier. We have au pairs in our home almost throughout the year. And we get them in from Mexico. And we started this in 2015 when we moved the whole family back to Canada. And we're on our 8th au pair right now. She's with us. So this is our very first au pair. And it says 15/08/14. That's 1 week after she came to our home. Oh, And I want to let you see how effective this strategy is.
Uno.
Uno,
メインは
dos,
なんだっけジャシューと
tres,
の
cuatro, cinco, seis, siete, ocho, nueve, 10.
First, 7 days after he was exposed to Spanish, it's just amazing.
¿Qué es este?
Un avestruz.
Petrus,
Avestruz.
apertura,
Sí. ¿Y este? No, yo no sé.
elefante,
Sí. ¿Y este?
no te,
Un camello.
un camello.
Camello.
Yo gusta el
A mí
camello.
me gustan los camellos.
A mí me gusta el
Los
camello.
And this is my youngest.
¿Dónde están tus manos? Manos. Sí. ¡Sugoi! ¿Y tu nariz? ¿Nariz? ¿Dónde está tu nariz? Sí. ¡Ah, sugoi! ¿Tu cabeza? ¿Cabeza? Sí. ¡Atama, soso! ¿Tu boca? Sí. ¿Y tus ojos? ¿Ojos? ¿Dónde están tus ojos? ¿Águila?
So, all this to say, the strategy really works. And again, I'm going to come back to our first au pair, Angélica.
Cuenta hasta 5.
No,
Yo.
no, sí.
Yo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
じゃあグレーのやつ入ってる
Aquí. Aquí. Aquí.
¿Dónde estás?
¿Dónde
estás?
Aquí.
¿Dónde?
Abajo de la mesa.
¿Abajo de la mesa?
Aquí. Abajo de la mesa.
¡Guau! ¡Te encontré! Espera, mi hija se golpeó.
開かないね
¿Qué pasó? Estás saliendo herida.
Mami, Angélica가 롱장가 사갔어요.
そうなの
你跑到哪里去？
Te encontré.
我跑到这边来吃。
真的吗？
I have piles of videos of each language, but here's one where he uses all 5 in 1 minute, and I can show you this one. I gotta learn how to use this.
Ronnie, let the car. Ronnie, let the car. Uy, me atan.
Ronnie.
Ronnie, ¿me pasas la matraca? Sí. ¿No tienes la verde? Ay, se me fue. Pásala de nuevo. ¿Tienes la verde? ¿Dónde está, no? ¿Qué hiciste, no?
La verde.
Ajá, ¿dónde está la verde? La matraca verde.
No, es azul.
Pero había una verde.
No es una verde, es una azul.
Have you made the track here, Ronnie? Is it done?
Es
Wow.
azul en mí.
Excellent, you made it by yourself?
Ya.
Wow.
真的吗？你这个叫什么？你刚刚在玩什么？
Trains.
哎，
So, I mean, this is daily life. Every day, it's this language. You can talk for an hour with mommy in Japanese. If I walk into the room, they turn around. It's automatically Mandarin. It's just a habit. So I think, this is my last slide to show you through language you can definitely give your children the gift of the world, but do it early. Okay, we have the mic so that we can record the questions also.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is regarding the written language.
Yes.
So I understand they pick it up very easily, the oral, but have you introduced the written languages to them? How many and how is that going? And have you seen any research on do this many or don't? And so that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, it's a great question. Thank you very much. Honestly, we don't push the writing so much. Our kids, when they see certain apps on the iPad and stuff, they'll go on and play and learn a lot of the kanjis and Japanese or Mandarin writings. They go to school here mainly, so English and French. From that perspective, we're not so worried. It's really about Japanese and Mandarin, but at the same time, I think what's more important is the reading, and that is also still secondary to speaking and listening. So we don't push it so much. We don't think it's as important. It is important, but not as important. And we do it as much as we can, but through a natural process. We won't sit them down and do drills. We never do that. If they like certain games, we love gamifying things. They've learned to play certain, the drums and piano through apps. And that's really how we go about it. And with writing, they have these apps where they sort of trace the characters and score points. And they do it to a certain degree, surprisingly well. When we go to Japan, they are able to read standardized to their age so far. But I do expect it to be harder and harder as they go into second year, third year, fourth year. But we tell them it's okay. It's not a big deal. I learned how to read Japanese and Mandarin, although I've never went to school in Japanese and Mandarin. It's a lot of reading mangas and toys. My parents would buy, remote control cars in Japan, and I'd have to build it. Then I have to read it to read the instruction manual. That's how we sort of motivate them to do the reading. And if you can read, you can type, for the most part. And through working in Japan, I've learned how to, work around it. So it's not so important to be able to write with your hands today. In fact, many Asians have lost the ability to write very well with their hands. I see somebody smiling, I guess. It's true to a certain degree. Okay.
I've got a two-part question. I do a lot of language activism, language revitalization. There are no more monolingual speakers of my ethnic language. My wife is a native speaker. I am not, although I'm pretty fluent. We have two children, 2 and 5, who we're raising in Chicago. There's no other native speakers around us. They both speak our language as their primary language. We have gotten further than any of the other people we know who have tried to do this, even though and we speak 3 languages at home, but we speak to them exclusively in our language. So we're very anxious because we do all the things that you're talking about. Our friends tell us that they do the same things, but they're not successful. And I don't know if maybe they're not really doing those things. Maybe they're not really religious about one language, one parent, so on and so forth. So the first part of my question is, when you've seen, perhaps you've seen or you've read about other people trying to do the same things that you have succeeded in doing, that so far we've succeeded in doing, but maybe others who have not succeeded, is it because of something that they're not doing properly or they're not realizing they're not doing properly? What advice can you give to a guy like me who's just so excited that I've gone further and more successful than anyone else I know who's trying to do this, and so anxious and worried that I'm going to lose grasp at some point? And then my second part of the question is, at what point would the language be so solid in my children's head that even if they make it less primary and they switch to English or Russian or Turkish or any of the other languages, Arabic, any other language we speak, at what point would the ethnic language be solid enough that they could still just re-grasp it when they're around native speakers?
All right. It's a tough question. Your first part is tough. I do see a lot of people failing, and I think you've hit it. Hit the thing on hit the nail on the head. I think most people are not consistent with the one person, one language. it's my opinion that you really have to follow it religiously. Because if you give your children the option to speak other languages, then they will probably pick the one that's easiest to them. And it's often the one that's in the community, that's the one that their friends speak. So it's so important to start from day one to build that habit to speak that one language with your kids, and make it weird to speak any other language with them. So that's the natural part where they switch around because it's so easy and so natural for them to associate one language with a person. So, but in your case, it's difficult because other than yourself, you don't have other sources of that input. Like what we do is, even though parents speak that language, we also take them to Japan, where they could really immerse and really strengthen it, and go to Taiwan and go 24/7 in Mandarin, at least a part of the year. So I guess it's other than yourself doing it, I don't know. It's exactly, I guess, and try to find other sources of input. And with respect to time, I would say, at least our goal with our kids is to do it base case at least till 10, and as much as possible up to 12, up to the end of elementary school. That's our aim. Hopefully we can. And I left Taiwan when I was 13, when I finished elementary school, until 27. 29 when I went back to Asia, and I had colleagues and I had a lot of opportunity to speak Mandarin, and I never lost it. Whereas other languages that I learned later in life, like during studies, I studied German, Italian, got good grades, but I still lost them because it's a learned language rather than an acquired language, like Mandarin for me. Okay.
Hello. Hi, Tetsu. Thanks for the talk.
So
I just have a
here?
very, very quick question. Hello.
Okay, hey, Edwin.
So I'm just curious. I noticed in one of the videos, one of your children was speaking in Mandarin, and then they didn't know the word for train, so they switched back to English quickly. And I was wondering, do they usually switch back to English when they don't know a word in another language,
No,
or do they switch
not necessarily
Japanese?
English. It could be Japanese. It could be
anything.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, that's called code switching. Not a big deal.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up, but I will be around.